Namaste, dear viewers. Today we have the privilege of speaking to and understanding insights from Mr. David E. Card, the recipient of the Nobel Prize for the Economic Sciences in the year 2021. We had a wonderful conversation with him and he's explained everything in such a humble and simple manner. And I'm sure it will give all our viewers a lot to look forward to and a lot to hope for in line with the theme of this issue. So we are incredibly excited for you to view this interview. Thank you so much. Hi. I'd like to start off with a very Nepali greeting. Namaste to you, sir. And I'll just give you a little bit of context about where we're approaching you from. So, as we've established in our previous correspondence, I'm the chief editor of Vistas, which is an annual for St. Xavier's College, Maitigar. And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Nepal as well. I believe that Nepal would be a dream for an economist like you because many of the problems that you speak about, we experience them every day at a large scale. So it is an incredibly exciting context to be in with many challenges and opportunities. And we're just so glad that we can extrapolate some of your insights to this context as well. So without any further ado, with your permission, can you please start the interview?
Sure. Mhm.
So I'd like to start by understanding more about you as a person. How do you recollect the foremost moments of your life and what memories do you have from that time, sir?
Oh, uh, hmm. Well, I grew up on a small farm in Canada, and I didn't have anything too exciting happen in my early life. I went to a rural school. There was one room with six grades in it, um, and for a few years, and then eventually I went to a school, a more modern school. That was helpful for me because I already knew how to read when I got to school, so I could kind of follow on with more advanced grades. so, uh, that was kind of helpful, and as a result of that, I was able to miss a couple of grades. They just put me in a higher grade, so that meant I was finished school a bit earlier than other kids. Yeah, I don't know whether there was anything too exciting. I mean, one thing that when I went to high school, I was in the peak of the baby boom in Canada. So the baby boom was this period when a lot of children were born. So when I went to high school, it was very crowded, and there was many grades of kids all at once, and so they divided us all up into different classes. And I met a number of people in my ninth grade class who I'm still friends with. I was in a class that was all boys because we were learning how to do things in a woodworking shop, and the girls were in a different class. And so that was kind of a good experience. And some of my best friends were from that time.
That's really nice to know, sir. When we look at many academics who are extremely accomplished, we see that they have many academic influences within their family in their early lives. But that has not been the case with you, as far as I can tell. So, did that present any hurdles for you?
Um, Not really. One of my father's brothers was a professor, one of my uncles. And his sisters and other brothers they all went to university, which was pretty unusual.
So, sir, now looking more into your area of interest, breaking this down to a rudimentary level, can you please tell us why it is important for students like us to care about conversations about economics? What is fundamentally important about the nature of these conversations?
Uh, well, economics is attempting to understand um, how the market economy works. And most people in the world are living in a market economy, at least partly. And so it helps you to understand, why some people have high wages and some people have low, and why some businesses are doing well and others are not doing well. And it also gives you some insights into um, possibly things that the government could do to try and affect the labor market or the general outcomes of people.
Right. So, in the pursuit of economic efficiency, from what I understand, in your research, you've also ensured that you promote social justice at the same time. So, why has this been so important for you?
Uh, well, I wouldn't say that I don't really work on that's those questions are really what are called questions of welfare economics, questions about what how things could happen. I don't really do that. What I do is I try and study the way things are working in the labor market. But I guess I tend to work on questions that involve lower wage workers. So that means that sometimes the results are attract attention because they suggest things about the way the labor market works for low wage workers that is a little different than what people thought was true in the past or something. The reason why I guess because most of my family are low wage workers. It seemed obvious that that was an important question.
So, can you please break down for our viewers maybe what answers you've explored along the way and how maybe we can adapt that to the Nepali context as well?
Well, I worked on many different questions. One question I've worked on a lot of times in my life was how schooling affects people later in life.
Mm.
And one part of that is just a simple question. If you get more schooling, do you get higher wages and better health and live longer
Mhm.
when you're older? And my results have always shown that. A second result is that if the schools are better quality, spend more, and teachers are better trained, and so on, the children who go to those schools tend to do better. They live longer and have higher wages and are more likely to succeed, and their children are more likely to succeed as well. So schools are a big, a big important thing, and presumably, in a lot of very poor countries, that's the number one problem is the schools are, getting people to go to school, and it's difficult because everyone needs to make a living, and oftentimes children have to help at home and so on. But in the long run, basically in the world economy, you kind of need a fairly high level of education to thrive and survive.
Would you say that your primary recommendation for a country like Nepal would also be that we emphasize schooling more?
Yeah, I think that's almost always a good idea. If you know nothing else, that's still a good idea. Because in the long run, that will pay off. It might be might not make everyone completely happy or solve all the problems, but I think it will help. It won't hurt anybody.
So a slight segue to research in general. You had identified that the lack of empirical evidence in economic research was a fundamental hurdle to the findings actually being used in policy making, right? So from what I understand, academia is considered to be largely isolated from actually influencing world outside academics. And in this situation, how can we actualize evidence-based policy making in countries like Nepal?
Um, well, I don't know anything really much about Nepal, but I do know in a lot of countries, Western countries, there is in fact quite a bit of interplay between academia and government. So I never did this myself, but many of my colleagues and friends went and worked in the government for a while.
Mhm.
And they take some of what they learned and they try and help make better policies. So I think usually in Western economies there is some interplay. It goes up and down. So obviously, some governments are more friendly to evidence-based policy, and some are less so.
Mhm.
Um, most I think people think that the evidence-based methods are better, but a lot of times, especially more conservative politicians, are somewhat suspicious of academics.
I suppose so. So where does your personal stance lie? How important is evidence in policy making?
Well, I think that if you don't have any evidence, you don't know what you're doing. So I wouldn't think that it is. I mean, people come up with policies a lot of times very poorly thought out. In all honesty, a lot of policies that
Mhm.
they may not need very much evidence because a lot of times the policy is trying to help one group or help another group, and it's fairly clear that that will happen. Usually what economists are trying to do is say, well, if you do this, it will help this group a lot and it'll hurt this group a little bit, or vice versa.
Mhm.
So you're trying to basically provide a broader view of what policies will do. So usually I think politicians have some idea of some of the beneficiaries of a policy, but not necessarily all of the beneficiaries and all of the costs.
So, for young students and academics of the next generation of Nepal who are watching this, what steps do you recommend they take to ensure that policy-based, evidence-based policy making is a reality for our nation?
Well, I don't think that's easy to say. I mean, I think there's even in governments like in the United States can slip a bit. So presumably, there's a lot of concern what will happen if Mr. Trump is reelected president. He wasn't somebody who was very willing to follow evidence-based policies and was more concerned about following his own ideas. So, you can't, I don't think I can really give any solid advice other than, we hope that people who are elected have a little bit more concern for understanding what's going on and knowing the limits of what they can and can't do.
So, sir, would I be correct in saying that with your promotion of empirical findings within economics, you made a move that was not conventionally made by the status quo at the time?
There were people doing that. It has become more common in the economics field in the last 40 years. A long time ago, economics it was harder to collect evidence. There wasn't as many empirical evidence. We didn't have computers. We didn't have modern data sets. But also economics traditionally was more of a philosophical field. So maybe people will study Adam Smith or will know about those kind of Marx was considered an economist. And they kind of had some vague idea of what was going on, but they didn't really they weren't in a situation to really say, well, the evidence says this versus that. They didn't really have that kind of quantitative information.
Mhm.
Also, the field of statistics wasn't developed until 60 years ago. So even the ability to really analyze data was only developed in the last 100 years.
So my understanding of the Nepali academic community, the challenges that you faced back then, maybe we face many of the same challenges now with our lack of maybe the development in the sort of technology that we can access, right? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the challenges you faced back then in making this move that was so different from the status quo and how you navigated that.
Um, well, one thing I guess I was able to go to United States and go to a PhD program in the United States, which was very much more um, aligned with that way of doing things than it was even in Canada. At that time, Canada wasn't totally far behind, but it was the new thing was more what was going on in the United States, and particularly at the university that I studied, there was people there. So one thing that I guess you could say is that people probably need to travel and visit outside the country and see what's going on in the institution, in Britain or in the United States. And nowadays in a lot of Western European countries, there's quite a bit of empirical research as well. So that's helpful.
I suppose so. And from this, I'd like to take this to how helpful is the fact that your work is recognized by the academic community, and does it make a difference in your professional life?
Um, Maybe a little bit. I'm retired now, so it doesn't matter anymore. um, uh, but at one time, I guess if you get recognition and win some award or something, people ask more questions, and
Yeah.
you have an opportunity to try and get some attention toward particular things that you think are important.
Mhm. From this, I'd like to connect this to the fact that there are individuals who are proponents of the theory that we live in an era of intellectual imperialism, right? Where certain trains of thought are more dominant or more widely recognized. Is this something that you experienced as well, or something that you agree to?
Uh, I would say sometimes in economics there were ideas that were very powerful and were influential that might not have, that we don't no longer think about, or that we now understand were a bit flawed. Um, and so, for example, very simple ideas about how the economy, the macroeconomy works,
Mhm.
have turned out to be very, difficult to. They probably were some mistakes with or incorrect aspects of that. So now I think in economics, there's much better understanding that we don't know as much as we thought we did.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of other areas, I'm always surprised at how, there's a lot of other things besides scientific research that are important in day-to-day life. Religion, for example, is extremely
Mhm.
important for many people. That isn't really based on science, or it isn't really that kind of thing. So if and presumably um, a lot of other views about nature of how people interact and so on are traditional, inherited from past culture ideas and things.
Mhm.
Those things, those are probably more important than we realize.
Yeah, and with that, what I'd like to also talk about is, do you believe that the mainstream theories that exist about a societally or culturally influenced subject like economics are more influenced by the findings in developed nations rather than smaller nations?
Uh, well, actually, in the last 40 years, there's one thing that's happened is a huge amount of interest and work in developing countries, empirical work. So there's a lot of research being done in Africa and India in particular, would be places that friends of mine do research all the time. They try and look at education programs and family programs and children health programs and so on. And oftentimes that research is done very carefully with an attempt to try and do some kind of a experimental analysis to see if two alternatives are proposed, which one is better.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's there are some problems with those approaches sometimes, but I think that's there's quite a bit of recognition and interest in the U.S. and in the Western world of trying to make things better for poorer countries. A lot of major foundations like the Gates Foundation and other foundations actually are quite interested in helping. I mean, the size of the problems are huge.
Yeah.
So even a large amount of study isn't necessarily going to fix everything. But I think it isn't the case that people are not interested or concerned. I think it's more that there's so many problems to solve, and then we get sidetracked with problems with wars and things like that. Yeah.
Definitely. So speaking more about the methods, what would you say would be a better approach for academic communities that are starting to just boom like Nepal, right? So should we try to build off of established theories that have predominantly come from developed world countries, or should we try to start from scratch and figure out things along the way, fitting it to our context, of course?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the basic ideas about how people make choices um, are pretty standard and would be the same in even in really poor countries in Western Africa, for instance. And
Mhm.
some things are different. The capacity of the government to introduce programs is much lower. The social safety net is much smaller, so individuals are much more reliant on their family and on their own resources.
Mm.
Um, the labor market and the housing markets and so on are somewhat poorly developed, so there isn't necessarily going to be straightforward analyses that you could take completely the same as are done in the United States, for example. But you could, I think there's a lot to be learned from research that's being done in other relatively poorer and developing countries. I think that people there are trying to adapt ideas to the right context.
That is true, incredibly. So, something that I've been curious about ever since you've mentioned the areas that your research has been concentrated in, did you actually find that earnings were correlated to your schooling or how long
Oh
you've
yeah,
been in school for? Oh,
yeah,
yeah, it was.
yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Well, actually, almost always you find that better educated people have higher wages. But the question has always been, is that because they got educated, or is it because they were going to earn more anyway and they were able to go to school? So, in a country where very few people go to university, usually the people who do go to university are from well-off families,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to do fine. So, so the university might not be the thing that makes a difference. So my research has been more on like, can you find sort of what reasons why one group of people went to college in one setting but not in another?
Right.
And one of the studies I did was on the effect of growing up near to another university. So if
Mm-hmm.
you, and that doesn't really affect children from rich families, but it affects children from poor families quite a bit. And actually, that was my own case. So when
So,
I was in high school, I worked at the university because there was a nice library and I could read things there.
mm. So, touching more upon your life as a young student yourself, do you think that you imbibed any values in those days that have stayed with you throughout your career that have really ensured that you've been as successful as you've been?
Um, well, maybe to some extent. Um, so if you grow up on a farm, farming work is very hard, and you work every day. You have to work, 8 or 10 hours a day, and so I always thought that other jobs are much easier than that. So I probably worked longer hours than most other people, but not as long as a farmer. So, that one advantage of growing up on a farm is you realize that there's a lot of people are wasting a lot of time. They could be working harder. In the United States, lots of people, watch television or watch sports or something like that. And it always seemed to me like, okay, that's okay, but it isn't that productive.
Yeah, I'm sure our students will try to imbibe that grit and persistence after they watch this interview. So, uh, any particular memories from your time as a young student that you really felt like this was an influential moment?
Hmm. Um, not really. I I was very lucky. What one thing that happened to me, I guess I could mention one thing that happened to me. So I had because of a friend I met in high school. Um, his father was an engineer and worked at a factory, and I was then
Mhm.
able. His father got me a job at this company, and that was very helpful for me because I needed the money to go to college. So basically, I've always been a believer in the help that is provided by people's friends, and I think that it's really important for people who have some advantage to try and spread their advantage around to other friends and other family members and so on. And that was always very helpful to me. So I was a huge beneficiary of help from people who really could have done something else, but they did somehow just help me enough to get me along the way.
That's incredibly sweet. And I think that that's also a testament to the fact that you've taken time out of your very busy schedule to correspond with us today. And that has been incredibly helpful to us as well as our wider student community. So, what about as a professor? Were there any particularly influential moments from your time, from your tenure as a professor?
Well, I had many PhD students. I think about 130 PhD students, and so many of them, had a very influential moment in their career when they suddenly realized what they were going to study.
Mm,
And I always found that extremely nice moment because then people, when they're working on their PhD, have to kind of eventually figure out what it is that they're going to do research on, and it's very challenging, very stressful to people to come up with a good topic and to understand how to do it. And if you do that and you succeed, you'll be able to get a good job and go on. And if you don't, it's very difficult. So I remember for many of these students, I remember the moment that they were be sitting in my office or they would come and talk to me, and all of a sudden we would realize, or I would realize at least, what it was that they were actually going to do, and that was going to be a really good topic. Um, and I definitely think of those as great moments for my career.
yeah. And your passion is extremely contagious, I can tell just from this short interview. But I'm sure that comes with a lot of stress as well, right? Because when you're passionate about a cause, you're going to want to give it your best. So, how has that relation between passion and stress worked out for you in your life?
I think I'm lucky in that I'm not a high stress person. Um, I I can get kind of stressful about really stupid things like getting a computer program to work. But on the kind of things that other people worry about, like um, what's going to happen to their career or whether they're going to get a job or something. For some reason, I've never been that worried about that. Maybe because I was kind of confident that at least I would, if worse came to worse, I could always go back to farming.
Yeah, now just to make this sort of more open-ended, I feel like we've touched a lot of grounds, but I'm sure there's something that you would like to touch on yourself that perhaps maybe I haven't brought up so far. Is there anything in particular that you would like to speak about?
Hmm. Um, well, I guess I would say that the sometimes I think if you grow up in a poor environment and things are very challenging, and right now in the world it's a little bit tough.
Mhm.
And I guess it's very important. I would say it's very important for people to hope for or to look forward to uh, things will get somewhat better, and hopefully at some point in the future there will be more opportunities, and sometimes those things take a long time. I think people kind of forget how long it's taken for you know modern economies to become as well off as they are. um, is a long time ago, people didn't live very long and they had pretty tough lives, and it is sometimes a decisions and so on, I think, have to take a slightly longer perspective. And so that would be my suggestion, is to try and think a little bit more like where will we be 10 years from now rather than 10 minutes from now.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important thing to remember. But any message, sir, to the wider academic community in Nepal who is really anticipating your message for them?
Oh, well, I wish them all very good luck, and I hope that that they have some interesting challenges and opportunities along the way, and maybe they'll get a chance to help the country proceed and do better in the future.
I'm sure they'll be motivated to do so after this address. Now, I just request you to answer very few short questions because most of our viewers are young high school students. So, just some recommendations for them. Is there a book that you would recommend to them?
Mm. Um, I like lots of books.
You can name as many as you
So
want.
is a well, as a Westerner, I think I found it important to read books that were very critical of Western ideas. So Joseph Conrad, the famous, he was actually Polish, but he was a British writer, and he was very critical of British and policies of the colonial powers, and I think that was very influential and helpful to read that. I would say there's so many incredibly talented writers of novels. I read a lot of novels. I can't really say what the best ones to read are. There's one book that I really like. It's by a Irish writer named David Mitchell. It's called
Mhm.
Cloud Atlas. That's a great book, very creative, and has a long perspective on things that can go bad. So, yeah, I really like the Portuguese author Saramago. He won the
Mhm.
Nobel Prize in the early 90s. He grew up in a very poor family in Portugal, and his books have they're very sympathetic to ordinary people. Um, so those would be a few authors that I would think about. Oh, the Italian author Italo Calvino.
Mhm.
He wrote short stories and novellas in the 1940s and 50s. Is a great writer too.
Okay, a technique that helps you overcome procrastination.
Uh, Deadline. I tend to put things off until the deadline, but so I do find that a deadline is helpful. Yeah.
So something that may help the reader find their love for economics.
May help what?
Will help our readers find their love for economics if they're inspired after this
Oh,
interview to start searching.
well, that's interesting. Um, well, some people really like um, to read sort of the classic books in economics. I always found them a little confusing, but some people really like them. Adam Smith or Keynes, the
Mhm.
author writer. Um, I was more taken with writers from the 1950s. They were the first economists who tried to use mathematics carefully. Were writing in the 1950s. And one of them was a guy, a economist who's still alive, but is quite elderly, named Robert Solow.
Mhm.
Um, and he wrote a lot of incredibly insightful papers. They're a little bit technical, but not as technical as advanced research today. And he was a brilliant writer and an extremely insightful person. So I would say if you ever get a chance to read a paper by Robert Solow, you should read them. He wrote about growth theory. He wrote about unemployment. He wrote about how cities are organized. He wrote lots and lots of very insightful short papers that are still important today.
Is there a favorite quote or saying that you always remember?
Hmm. uh, not anything that really comes to mind. No.
That's completely fine.
Okay.
Is there a competition or an initiative that you would encourage our students to participate in or look into?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess there are many of those kind of things. I am not, to tell you the honest truth, I am not the biggest believer in competitive behavior. I
Mhm.
think that maybe a team competition. So if there's some kind of a competition where people are entering as a team, I think that's better for learning how to do things. And nowadays in economics, most research is conducted in teams, sometimes two or three people, but sometimes bigger teams. And outside of economics and outside of academia, if you work in a company or it's all about getting along with other people. So I would definitely say if you're going to compete in a contest, try to find one that involves a team and choose a bunch of people. Maybe choose some people that you don't necessarily know too well to put together a team and try and see what you can learn and do.
Finally, sir, the theme for our issue this year is Trailblazers of Hope. And you've given us a lot of hope with the work that you've done, and this conversation, I'm sure, will inspire many people to hope further. But what gives you hope, sir?
uh, well, if you see a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old kid, um, you realize that they're incredibly able to learn. So they can learn much faster than older people. And they're also very uh, interested in everything.
Mhm.
And so I always find little children between the ages of, I don't know, 3 and 10 or something, extremely inspiring because they seem like they're much smarter than all the old people. They're much more
Yeah.
curious about everything that's going on, and they're also much happier. So I think we try and be like an 8-year-old. That'd be that's my inspiration.
Thank you so much for your participation in this interview. So I've enjoyed this conversation very thoroughly. I hope you did too. And we are so moved by your kind spirit, and you're just such a radiant person. We really appreciate your valuable time and effort. Thank you so much,
Okay.
sir.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very enjoyable.
Thank you. Any closing
Okay.
messages?
No, best wishes to everybody. Thank you
Thank you.
for
Thank you
doing the
so
interview.
much, sir. Wish
Okay.
you a good night ahead.